So in the last lecture we went through emotions and motivation. And really the last lecture, today's lecture and next week's are kind of what I think of as being the core building blocks of social cognition. So emotion, here it's kind of interpreting signals from others, and in the next lecture it's kind of going beyond that, so mentalising and mirroring, going what's inside the head rather than just on what's on the outside. So again, these are some of the foundational processes that we'll encounter in lots of lectures. So historically, obviously, faces and bodies have been studied in terms of visual perception, obviously high-level visual perception, categorizing and recognizing and so on. But really, in terms of the function of seeing other people, it serves a social perception purpose. What we're trying to do is try and figure out about other people, because we're a social species. We want to extract as many clues to people's thoughts and feelings as we can. Given that we can't observe what's going on inside somebody's head, these are kind of a window onto their minds and their experiences, if you will. But again, something that is very much rooted in an evolutionary kind of biological past as well. So again, the kinds of things we might want to extract from bodies, faces, and also voices, although I won't talk about this really, is that you can infer what somebody is feeling, their emotion, from their expressions. You can infer potentially what people's intentions are from their gaze, or at least give you clues as to how they might act, what's driving their cognition. Or even just things like deception. So there are studies looking at people who play basketball where you kind of look there, but you're going to pass the ball to somebody else. So you're deliberately trying to use deceptive body language. But again, if you're a skilled basketball player, you can see through people's deceptive body language like this, that actually you know that they might be looking that way, but they're intending to pass another way. So although the core mechanism within the brain might be visual processes, the function in the real world is social processes. And this is a great example, although it's a scary example, of going beyond the information that's given. And it's been replicated in quite a lot of other studies, although obviously mainly in Western cultures in which you have these kind of democratic processes. This was done in an American congressional election where you've got pairs of people who are competing for Congress. And what the task is that you're shown a pair of people who are competing for a given, I don't know, is it state or city or whatever, and you're asked two things. One is, do you recognise any of them as being familiar? If that's the case, then you discard those pairs. So you're only looking at those who are least subjectively unfamiliar. And then the second question is something like, how competent does this person look? Okay. So what you've got on the x-axis here is a purely subjective evaluation of competence. But people agree on this, otherwise it would all average out to be close to zero. So people do, however they're doing this, they can have some agreement. And here is the actual difference in votes, presumably in some metric of kind of thousands or tens of thousands here. So again, you've got the strong positive correlation between how competent somebody is judged from an image here and how convincingly they won. Of course, it doesn't predict everything, and thank God, but it is something that is there in the data. So people do infer traits from faces, and it does influence their behaviour. So in the second part of the lecture, I'll look at that, why people do this, whether there's any truth in it. And again, I'm not trying to say it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just saying, do people do it, and why do they do it? So I'll start off by talking about the very kind of basic mechanisms of how we process faces. Then I'll kind of have a more social spin and talk about how we recognise expressions in people and whether these are tapping different mechanisms. I'll talk about bodies and body language, and also joint attention, how we figure out what people are attending to and how this is kind of a clue to what people are thinking. And then in the second part, so this will kind of take best part of an hour to go through this, and then about 30 minutes talking about trait inferences, so judging people's personality by their face, judging a book by its cover, in effect. So this is a model that most of you will be familiar with, at least those with psychology backgrounds. And this is kind of a basic cognitive model of face processing. The idea is that you take a kind of early visual image of a face, and what you do is that you try and extract something that is a 3D kind of volumetric, what's called a structural description of how the features are configured within the face, how they're kind of related to each other. And this would happen to all faces, whether or not you know them or not. Okay, so this is kind of high-level visual processing. And then, in effect, you've got two different streams, one that goes down here, and then one that goes down here. So if we look at the one here, this is, in effect, kind of different memory stores for faces and people that you know. So what you would effectively do is that you create a description of a face. And the idea is that you have something that is seen as being view-centered or view-independent. So if you see me 3/4 on, the idea is that you will kind of mentally rotate this to be a full frontal face, or similarly with inverted faces and so on. The idea is that we don't store representations of faces in all possible configurations. We have something that is like a prototype of the face, that is face on, eyes at the top, mouth at the bottom. But then you kind of match this structural description onto a store of all the faces that you know. So these are called face recognition units. And here this would be non-visual information, so information about whether that person is a lecturer, whether, other kinds of information, their name, and so on. So here this is to do with familiar people. Here, this is the kind of information that you can get from all people, so knowing their expressions and so on. We'll talk about whether there's a separate mechanism in the brain for extracting expressions that's completely different from this, as is implied in this model. Also, we can recognize lip reading and other kind of speech analysis. So even though most of you think you can't lip read, if you're in a noisy environment, then looking at somebody's lips is actually helpful. Now it doesn't make any difference. You'll hear me just as well whether you're looking at my face or not. But if you're in a noisy environment, literally the visual information kind of amplifies the auditory signal, and there are parts of the brain that pull this kind of information together. Here, this is kind of more strategic processes of you see two different faces and you have to kind of try and do a deliberate mental rotation. What's the evidence for this? Well, obviously, we'll talk about various neuroscientific evidence. Some of the earliest evidence came from this clinical condition called prosopagnosia. And the idea here is that people lose the ability to recognize familiar faces. So they have damage somewhere here, but actually they can perform to a greater or lesser degree this kind of process here. So let's have a look at a case.
Meet Terry Sweeney, a professional photographer. She was a firefighter until an injury damaged part of her social brain, the circuitry she uses to recognize faces. The disorder is called prosopagnosia. For example, the person Terry has been photographing here is her mother. Now, because of her injury, Terry can't recognize any face.
Make me smile.
Not even her own mother's. In this test, Terry takes a Polaroid picture of her mother.
Terry, you just took a picture of your mother. Yeah. And I want you to take a look at these and see if any of them are the picture you took or not.
Now, Massachusetts General Hospital researcher Dr. Nancy Etkoff shows Terry several Polaroids with only faces showing, and asks Terry to pick out her mother.
Okay, if you had to guess, which looks to you the most like your mother? Just looking now, you can't tell which one of these. None of these really look like your mother to you.
No.
Okay.
If you just cut off the face and I just look at the clothes, I can tell you.
Okay, do you want me to uncover them? Okay, why don't I do that? I'll uncover them so you can see what they're wearing and other parts of the picture.
And see, that's her, because the pink and purple shirt.
The shirt. You recognize the shirt.
it's the hardest, I think, with my family, not to be able to personalize them with a face or a sense of timing. You know, it's kind of like I've lost everybody, like everyone's gone, and all that I'm really left with are facts without faces, you know?
When Terry looks at these slides of famous faces, she can't recognize them, although other cues like hairstyle prompt a guess.
Is that Madonna? Because her hair, look at her hair.
It's Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, really? I always feel like I'm struggling and always feel like I'm fumbling through myself to find a connection, to find a bridge that'll just pull everybody right back all of a sudden.
Can you tell who that is?
No.
Okay. I say Bruce Springsteen.
That's not Bruce Springsteen, is it?
Why do you say that?
This guy's ugly.
Now take a look at that woman right there. Does she look at all familiar to you?
No.
Not at all. What if I say that's you?
I bet not be me.
It is.
Really?
Okay. Any kind of comments on this? So again, the curious thing about this is that obviously she can kind of see in the kind of conventional sense of it, but it's very hard to imagine what that's like. And the way that it's often described is that all faces look the same, so she can see a face as a face, but it's about the individuation of them. And other cues such as clothing, hairstyle, and so on can help. So that's one way of thinking about this. So within this kind of model, it's often seen here that there's a problem in either kind of mapping between the structural descriptions and these kind of stored units, or the stored units themselves go. It typically arises after brain damage in the parts of the brain called the visual ventral stream, but there is such a thing as congenital prosopagnosia, where people are born so-called face blind, that they struggle to recognise each other, including members of their own family, that they rely heavily on voices and so on. So we'll come back to prosopagnosia in a bit. In terms of more neural models, this is the model of Haxby et al., where in effect they divide face processing into two broad systems. One is what they call a core system, by which they mean neural resources that are relatively specialised for faces relative to other kinds of class of objects or visual stimuli, and the extended system, which is involved in face processing along with other things. So, for example, a good example of the extended system would be the kind of emotional circuitry of the brain, such as the amygdala, the insula, and other regions which are involved in face processing, but you wouldn't want to say that they are face-specific necessarily, but they are important for understanding and recognising faces. And these are the kind of regions we talked about last time. Here you've kind of got regions that are involved in here this would be more kind of the structural encoding phase in their model. And the two divisions here would broadly map on to the Bruce and Young model, in that here this is a kind of seen as being, well, they call it about invariant aspects of a face. So this is more the structural aspects that don't change on a minute-to-minute scale. So obviously your faces do change over time, but over a course of years and decades, not over the course of seconds and minutes. Whereas here you've got a set of processes that are dynamic, involved in things like gaze or movement of faces. So they make this distinction here. So obviously the dynamic aspects would apply to both familiar and unfamiliar faces where somebody's looking, but the invariant features, the kind of spatial configuration, would be more person-specific, to more like a memory store of faces, really. So these are the three regions that they highlight as being kind of part of the core system. The other regions shown in red are the equivalent regions for kind of bodies, which are obviously spatially quite similar. So this early region here, the occipital face area, is involved in physical aspects of a face. the fusiform face area is involved in kind of these invariant aspects of a face. So recognizing who a person is, for instance, is relatively invariant. And this longer region here, the superior temporal sulcus, is involved in more changeable aspects, so gaze, dynamic aspects of faces. But also, it's shaded in this way to emphasize the fact that it's also specialized for bodies as well as faces. So you've kind of got a convergence between the early specialization there and this kind of more joint responsiveness to both of them. So how do these different regions work? So if we take the earliest region, this occipital face area, the kind of way in which this is identified with fMRI is simply that you take regions that respond to faces versus objects, and this has a larger bold response to faces than other objects, as does this one here. But the special feature of this is that it responds to any change in facial images, irrespective of whether the person is known or unknown, whereas the fusiform face area is more to do with categorical perception. So this is a really great study called Morphing from Maggie to Marilyn, okay, where you present people with pairs of morphed images, one after the other. And the idea is that in fMRI, if you're seeing the same thing, then you effectively habituate. You show a reduced bold response over time if you're processing the same thing. Now, the interesting thing here is whether or not it's physically the same or whether or not it is categorically the same. Okay? So what do I mean by that? So here we've got two pairs of images that this is 100% Margaret Thatcher and this is 70%. But most people would judge these to be categorically the same. If I asked you to name them, most people would name them both as Margaret Thatcher. Here you've got a pair of different images where most people would name this as Margaret Thatcher and most people would name this as Marilyn Monroe. The interesting thing here is that these two pairs of images are as physically dissimilar from each other as those two pairs. But whereas these two are categorically the same, these are categorically different. Okay? What you find in the early brain region, the occipital face area, is that it doesn't care about this. So what it cares about is physical differences. So here, if you've got an identical image, so two images that are 100% Margaret Thatcher, you've got this habituation in the bold response. But here, any kind of change, whether or not it's within a category or between a category, pushes the bold response back up. Here, in the fusiform face area, basically you can have two images that are physically identical, or you could have two images which are categorically identical, such as these ones here, and you have habituation. So here, the fusiform face area just responds when an image is either is categorically perceived to be different. So it would habituate, in effect, to this image and to physically the same image, but it would not habituate to those. It would recognize these as different. So again, this is the idea that you've got some regions that are computing kind of physical similarity between faces and some that are computing identity. Who is this person? And here it's using a different kind of metric in order to do that, one which is further along in the visual processing stream. So as you go further up, so the fusiform face area, this region that's involved in identity, also is more strongly tuned to upright faces, whereas the occipital face area shows less of a distinction between upright and inverted. So again, it's more tuned to the environment, the fact that we don't live in zero gravity and so on, that we're used to seeing faces in one way round. And this is the claim there that I've just been through. People debate whether this really is face-specific or not, and really, I think for our purposes, this might be going to hair-splitting, but the kind of evidence that people have used is whether or not it responds to these kinds of learnt distinctions. So what you do is that you train participants to discriminate between these things here. So you have to categorize them according to which family they are. Males have certain features, are females more droopy ears? Is that what it is? I don't know. But again, these are non-facial stimuli, supposedly. But as you become a Greeble expert, they're called Greeble, you start to activate this fusiform face area. people who kind of defend the idea that this is a face area just say, well, these are a bit like faces, and you're kind of effectively treating them as if they are little people or something like this. There's other evidence that actually this region also, if you're an expert in cars or dogs and things like this, that actually it's involved in that kind of identity discrimination as well. So the jury's out, but it might be that it's evolved for faces because that's the one thing which you can guarantee you're going to encounter in your evolutionary past, but it might become adapted to cars and other things that our brains aren't adapted to deal with, but in which you effectively recycle some of the same neuronal machinery. So you could argue it both ways, potentially. So within this more neural model, the third core region is this region called the superior temporal sulcus. And this is the region that's seen to be involved in the more changeable aspects of faces. So not in terms of who it is, but in terms of, well, I guess more social aspects of the face, such as gaze and expression, or at least that is the claim made by Haxby. So here, this is a nice study in which you've got the same set of faces, but in one case you're making a judgment about where the person is looking, and in the other case you're making a judgment about who the person is. So here you've got physically the same stimuli, but you're making different kinds of cognitive appraisals on them. If you're making a judgment about where the person is looking, then you activate your superior temporal sulcus more than the FFA, whereas if you're making a judgment about who it is, the balance of activity here flips over. Okay, so the same physical stimulus, but your judgment and processing of them is affects the relative activation within this network of regions. And this is a region that responds to bodies as well as faces. If you think back to the Bruce and Young model, it also had parts of the brain involved in linking together speech and sounds, so visual speech, seeing the lips move, and heard speech. And again, this is part of the brain that does respond to both certain sounds as well as vision. So what you've got here, for instance, this is single-cell recordings from primates, and they would see somebody moving their lips. I think it's probably a monkey that they see rather than a human. I would have to check that in the paper. But anyway, they see somebody going, which is a monkey signal. It doesn't mean much in our social world, but it does to them. And at the same time, they hear various sounds. So they either hear that sound, or they hear a kind of a panting, a threat-based sound, or a cooing sound. And here what you've got are, this is just the number of action potentials over time there. And what you can see, if you look at these 4 different conditions, that this is just vision alone, but when you've got vision with the corresponding sound, you've got some neurons in the superior temporal sulcus which effectively boost their firing rate. So it's kind of saying, yes, this is the right vision and sound together. Whereas if you've got the vision alone or the vision with an incongruent sound, you don't get the same kind of level of activity. So the idea is that this is regions of the brain that are integrating different kinds of signals. So dynamic signals from the face, both in terms of gaze, but in terms of lip movements and other kinds of things. What about expressions themselves? So if you think about the 2 models, they both have somewhat different claims. So both models say that expressions are important, but for somewhat different reasons. So the Haxby model says that expressions are important simply because they're dynamic. So in this model, expressions are kind of similar to where you're looking and how your mouths are moving. It's that kind of cognitive process. In the Bruce and Young model, they instead have a specialized module for dealing with expressions, and that they separate it from other kinds of dynamic processes. So you have got these 2 different models. As it turns out, neither of these models fully accounts for the data on how we process facial expressions. So what you find, so if you ask the question, what parts of the brain kind of so if you damage parts of the brain, what parts affect your ability to recognize facial expressions, but not who the person is? The kinds of regions you get out are your core regions of the kind of emotional brain, such as the amygdala and the insula, as discussed last time. So it seems to suggest that these are the main regions involved in recognizing emotions, which Haxby et al. Say is the extended system, but it seems to be involved in other aspects as well. What parts of the brain kind of lead to problems in recognizing all kinds of emotion from faces? Again, there are two regions here that seem to come out. One is the orbitofrontal cortex, which we talked about last week in terms of more subjective emotional experience. So when you think a wine is super good, for instance, based on either your beliefs or on how good it tastes, that's your orbitofrontal cortex. If you lesion that, actually you're quite bad at recognizing facial cues and actually cues from voices, but you're pretty good at recognizing who the person is. So again, this is part of the brain that serves a more generic function in emotional processing. The other region that you get coming out are not regions involved in emotion. They're regions involved in more motor processes. And this has led to the idea that, of simulation. The way that we recognize other people's emotional expressions is that we effectively map them onto our own motor system. So we look at how somebody's musculature is kind of moving, and we effectively understand that by thinking about how we would move our musculature to get that same expression. And this has led, again, this is obviously linked to the idea of mirroring and imitation as kind of foundational for social neuroscience. And there is some evidence for this. I think it's overstated in the sense that it's probably not the only mechanism by which we recognize expressions. I think we can do it via kind of emotional process, visual processes, but this is important too. I'm assuming that that's the year 2000. And neither of the models actually predict this. Neither of them kind of have a role of kind of simulation or motor processes in expression formation. So here, this is, so EMG is electrical recording of muscles. You've got pairs of electrodes. Often you've got a pair here for kind of frowny and a pair here for smiley and other things. But basically, if you're watching other expressions, you will spontaneously do this, even if it's irrelevant to the task. If you damage parts of the brain that are involved in bodily perception, so your somatosensory cortex and Broca's area, which obviously is kind of one of your mirror neuron areas, it does impair your ability to recognize expressions in others. It doesn't reduce it to zero, but it is there. You could also take people who don't have brain lesions and apply TMS over their somatosensory cortex and show that actually it does affect their ability to recognize expressions, but not who the person is. So again, this suggests that you're using your motor system for some aspects of processing faces, but not others. Oh, and this is another fun study. So here this is, if you put a pen in your mouth like this, apparently this uses a lot of your kind of smiling muscles in effect, but it affects your judgments about other people's facial expressions, particularly of happiness. So here, this is if you bite it. So obviously these are subtle expressions of happiness. Most people would recognize a happy face with about 99% accuracy, but if you've got more subtle cues of happiness where you morph a neutral image to make it slightly smiley, you can get kind of 60% accuracy that effectively goes down to 50% accuracy when you're performing this weird thing here, but not when you're performing other weird things as well. And it affects other kind of categories of emotion less so. It's just a fun example of simulation. So if we think about our models of face processing, both models make interesting and important predictions, but neither of them really account for simulation and expression recognition. It's unclear what the superior temporal sulcus region is doing. It seems to be genuinely important for gaze and lip cues, It may be involved in emotion expression processing, but it certainly isn't the main one. Other regions seem to be more core for dealing that, and these seem to be either involved in emotion perception or in more motor processing. And also that the emotion identity are at least partially separable, but maybe not completely so. So there's a whole literature about how these kind of things can interact. And to some extent, we'll come back to this when we look at traits in faces. So whether somebody's got slightly upturned lips and so on affects your judgment about their personality dispositions, whether they're likely to be smiley or not, and so on, a happy person or not. So that's faces. What about bodies? So just as there's specialized regions for processing faces, the idea is that there are parts of the brain that respond more to perceiving bodies than other objects. So again, this is fMRI evidence where you've got a region called the extrastriate body area, where you show it a whole series of different visual objects. And you kind of, this is not a percentage of activity relative to seeing this person here. So the best stimulus is actually a silhouette. So it's interesting that it's more kind of abstract body shape. It also responds to body parts as well as to whole bodies. But actually, it can be very schematic as well. So it responds almost as strongly to seeing this... what do you call that thing? This kind of stick man, as it does the real person here. You know, it's a very small difference between them. But it kind of drops away as you consider other bodies. And they've done other things, whether animals kind of have similar body parts, and so animals with legs have a bigger response than a fish, for instance, and things like this. So you've kind of got this graded response, but some element of it kind of dropping away as you go from human bodies to other things, or kind of, is that a body or not? But notice here, a face. So it's almost as if, in terms of early visual processing, you've got one part of the brain that processes the face, one part that processes the body. So it's slightly bizarre that you kind of have a sense of seeing a person as a whole, and obviously your visual system processes that, but actually you decapitate a person and process their head in one part of the brain, their body in another part, and presumably there's something that puts it all back together. But that does seem to be the case. So it responds to a person's face as much as it responds to a chair. So it's certainly not responding to social stimuli in any kind of very broad sense here. It is more specific than that. So the extrastriate body area is kind of on the again, kind of occipital lobes here on the outside, more kind of obviously high-level vision. There's another one that's a little bit further upstream that seems to be, it's not clear whether it's processing kind of the identity of people in the same way as the fusiform face area is, because it's not really clear that that's something that we do necessarily. But what it does seem to do is that it responds more to whole bodies. So whereas this early region responds to body parts and to whole bodies, this later region seems to be more specific to whole bodies. Okay. So there is an element of kind of hierarchy or progression here going, this is your visual ventral stream here, in terms of anatomy. So if those are your kind of body perception ones, what about dynamic bodies? So most of you would have seen this sort of thing before. Who thinks that that's a man? And who thinks it's a woman? So how many people think it's a man? Okay. How many people think it's a woman? God, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer. I thought it was a woman, but I'm really bad at kind of social cues, so I don't know what that is. Is that a man? But anyway, most people can extract this kind of information. But what you can do is obviously tell that it's a human as opposed to something else. So the kind of control stimuli that people use is that they take each of these dots and they have them moving in a random way. So in terms of early visual or localized visual processing, you can have a matched stimuli with dots moving, but you can't see any structural form in it. If you were to compare these two stimuli in fMRI, you can show that the superior temporal sulcus seems to respond to these kind of point-like walkers. And actually, it seems to be a part of the brain that differs from seeing other kinds of motion. So it seems to be relatively specialized to biological motion. So there are some patients who have damage to earlier visual cortex where they struggle to see motion in physical objects, but when they're asked to say, is that a human or non-human, from these point-like walkers, they can do it. So there seems to be somewhat separate regions for processing social cues versus non-social cues. You can also show this in single-cell recording, again in primates with either humans walking or monkeys walking, and show that there are neurons that are tuned in to these kinds of, they're abstract signals in the sense that you can't see the body shape. You're filling in the body shape from your top-down knowledge. It's just a pure motion cue. In fact, you can see that this is a body, but you can only really see it's a body properly when it moves. As with faces, there's evidence that, again, parts of the brain are involved in emotion are involved in extracting emotional cues from bodies. So here, the kind of thing that you can have is a fearful body, so somebody going like that, but in which the face is blurred out. For instance, you could show that that would activate the amygdala more than a neutral pose. And you can do studies such as this, where you've got an anger expression with an anger face, a fear expression with a fear face, and show that within about 100 milliseconds, this is using EEG, that the brain can kind of detect that this face goes with this body, but this face doesn't quite go with that body. So here, this is a fearful body and an angry face. So they don't look so good on these slides, but presumably they looked a bit better. But, yeah, the photoshopping isn't really great on these ones, but it's good enough for the brain to kind of be able to separate out the two things go together. So there's the other interesting thing about this is that if you're asked to judge the bodily, if you're asked to judge the facial expression, the bodily posture interferes with your judgment of the face. The reason why that's important is that it suggests that the cognitive processing of the body is automatic, in the sense that even when you're asked to ignore the body, the posture does affect your judgment about something irrelevant, well, not irrelevant, but something that is separate to it, the face. So although there might be separate regions, there's an idea that the two are pulling together at some point and influencing each other. Any questions about bodies or faces? We'll come back to it, but yeah.
I was wondering, when you talk about accuracy when referring to happy faces and sad faces and stuff, how do you decide on what is a happy face?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the question is, how do you kind of decide what's a happy face? Either that you go with the consensus option, or a lot of these studies would have facial morphs. So what, as I showed with kind of the Maggie and Marilyn thing, what you would have is that you would have a face that is that pretty much everybody agrees is neutral, a face that pretty much everybody agrees is happy. And then what you would do is that you would take the neutral face and impose, say, 10% happiness onto that. So that's the kind of way in which they're done. And you can get these kind of stimuli for morphing, and you basically just put little dots on all the, like the eyebrows and so on, for both of the templates, and then you can have a slider that kind of goes between them. So provided you can agree on the two endpoints, you effectively make an assumption about what the correct answer is in between. But yeah, that's how it's done. Okay, I'll go through this and then we'll have a little break. So joint attention is basically the idea that you can use eye gaze as kind of a clue to figuring out what people want. So this is a study done on autistic children where they're asked, for instance, in this upper image, where is the person looking? And they have no problem in doing that. But here, when they're kind of asked, what does the person want? They don't seem to kind of understand that looking might be a cue to kind of wanting here, whereas age-matched and IQ-matched children seem to get this more intuitively. obviously as people with autism age, this becomes kind of an easy thing, so they can develop other kinds of verbal knowledge to kind of understand that. But intuitively, understanding that looking is a route to kind of knowing and other intentions, it seems to be late developing or absent there. So obviously, kind of in terms of early diagnostics, also eye contact is one of the things that people would notice in an autistic child. So an absence of making eye contact or not. It doesn't mean that they can't necessarily follow the eyes. It's perhaps that they don't understand the social significance of the eyes is often the way that it's presented. So, although expressions, facial expressions, seem to be fairly distributed throughout the brain, a number of regions seem to support them. With regard to gaze, this seems to be a lot more specialised within the STS. So, for instance, the STS responds more to eye cues than arrow cues. So, seeing a pair of eyes looking to the left will activate the STS more than seeing an arrow pointing that way, for instance, where you could say that both have a kind of an attentional cueing function. One is a social stimulus in a way that the other one isn't. And there are other parts of the brain, such as the parietal lobes, which are involved in attention, that don't care whether it's a social or non-social stimulus, but the STS does seem to care. Basically, what you would have is that if you see a pair of eyes looking to the side, you've got more activity in fMRI if it's looking to an empty space than if it's looking to an object. And the reason for that is that looking to an empty space is kind of seen as being more surprising or kind of cognitively demanding. The fact that somebody's looking at something seems to be kind of a meaningful image, and it doesn't seem to involve quite as much activity. So this brain region seems to discriminate between a meaningful look to the side versus something that isn't. Interestingly, people with autism don't show that distinction. So it doesn't mean that their STS doesn't respond to eye gaze, but it doesn't seem to show this modulation about looking at something versus just looking per se, okay? Which is an interesting kind of potential disconnect there. Yeah?
I think for the autistic people, so there's no difference between the empty space and the object.
Correct. Yes, but yes, that's correct. Yes, so it's that difference between the two conditions.
They still have some, to some extent, activities.
That's correct. Yes, because you're doing a comparison. I'm not sure whether they had another baseline to show that, but in general, people with autism, they can process gaze. It's more other kinds of aspects of gaze. So there are other things, for instance, whether you kind of follow your eyes, or so somebody else is looking around and you follow your eyes with them. If you do that, you will activate the SES, but also part of your kind of theory of mind network. Whereas if you're just following a moving physical object, you don't activate your theory of mind network. But the people with autism don't seem to make that distinction between following another human person's gaze versus following a physical object that's just moving. That makes any sense. So there's other kind of evidence along those lines. In monkey kind of electrophysiology, you can find cells that respond to gaze direction. Also, if you lesion the STS, it abolishes a kind of processing of gaze, so being able to understand or kind of respond to gaze cues. It also responds to heads as well as eyes. And really, the idea is that it's coding kind of conceptually the locus of attention rather than the physical aspects of faces. So again, this is a part of the region of the STS that you find neurons that do this. So SA is spontaneous activity, and here you've got the number of action potentials, the spiking rates of the neuron to these different stimuli. So this stimulus seems to respond to downward gaze, but actually, it responds to downward gaze both when the head is looking down and when the eyes are looking down. So this image here and this image here are conceptually the same. They're both reflecting attention oriented down. Physically speaking, these three images are very physically similar to each other, and that is very physically dissimilar. So we can say that this neuron is coding something about that person's attentional orientation rather than just some physical aspects of the face here. It's actually coding something more meaningful. So again, these are relevant kind of social cues that found elsewhere. And these are the kind of experimental paradigms that are done kind of in cognitive psychology as well. And there's a bit of a literature on this, so it doesn't matter which face you've got. But the idea is you see a face such as this, and all you've got to do is just press a button when you see an asterisk appear. So in the second slide, the eyes look this way, and here the asterisk appears. So you're faster detecting the asterisk there, but should it appear there, you're a bit slower. So it's almost as if your gaze is, or your attention is cued here. Even if you don't move your eyes there, the idea is that you kind of know where it's going to go, or you're kind of interpreting some meaning. That would be, it doesn't matter whether you have smiley faces or real faces. So pointing is an interesting cue as well, simply because very few animals get it. So dogs seem to be a notable exception, that they kind of intuitively understand pointing. Chimps don't really, unless they've kind of been raised with humans, or at least that's my understanding of it. With that, if you take 18-month-olds, there've been studies looking at what the early markers of autism are before you kind of deal with more kind of advanced tests. And there's some that come out. One is pretend play. So if you're not doing pretend play at 18 months, that's a bad sign. The other one is involved around pointing. And there are two kinds of pointing, even though both look like that. And one is called proto-declarative pointing, and it means I want that. And one is proto-imperative pointing, which means look at that. Okay? And what you find is that children with autism, even at 18 months, they're impaired at proto-imperative pointing, look at that, but not I want that. So the idea is that the I want that could be a learnt cue, that you're pointing and you get a reward, a kind of more Pavlovian process. But actually pointing something just to draw attention to another person, to it, to kind of initiate joint attention, involves an understanding that that person cannot see what you can see, and that kind of communicative act. So that's one of the early markers of autism at 18 months, is that particular kind of pointing. So even though both involve the same motor act, they have quite different meanings depending on the social context. And again, the SDS seems to respond to pointing. And again, you've kind of got an interesting conjunction between what the head's doing, what the eye's doing, what's the arm's doing. So here, this is, again, single cell recording, and this is the number of action potentials. In this case, the person is looking at a target and reaching towards it to grasp it, and the neuron seems to have a large response. Here, the person is looking this way and doing that, and the neuron doesn't respond. So the idea here is that here you've got maybe an intentional action that the person is deliberately reaching, and here maybe they're doing something else, or actually the thing that they're interested in is over there. So they've got a different locus of attention to where they're acting, whereas here the locus of attention and their action are aligned, and the neurons seem to be tuned to the co-occurrence of these events. And the theory behind this is that this is a very kind of primitive way of signaling intentionality, what it is, why somebody's doing what they're doing, okay? That you also have in primates. It doesn't necessarily enable very advanced social cognition, but again, it's about building blocks that other aspects of cognition are involved with. Okay, so we'll take a break. What I kind of do at this point is this fun little puzzle. So the question here is that if you were to go out to a bar in Brighton, who are you most looking forward to meeting? Is it person A, B, C, or D? And of course you can go for the gender of your choice. So take a look at that, and then we'll do, there's no right or wrong answer. We'll do a poll as to who it is that you're most wanting to meet tonight. So who wants to meet person A? I would perhaps go for anybody else. What about person B? Okay, a few. And person C? Anybody? Okay, not popular. And D? Okay. So the idea here behind these, I can kind of explain how these are created, is that these are the personality types of person A, B, C, or D. And the idea here is that that is the kind of personality that you're looking for, and that you're looking for a person with that kind of matching face. I'll leave you to kind of debate with your friends whether there's any truth in this. Let's make a start again. So for the last 30 minutes or so, I'll talk about traits from faces. So a trait is a long-term disposition to behave or think in a particular way. And obviously, if you think about the models of face recognition presented so far, traits just don't appear. You know, you've got individuals, and you might learn, you know, what their personality is like. But you've got facial expressions, but there is no kind of traits in the kind of classic models of face expression. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which this is what we do. We go beyond the information that's given. And this is just generally true, you know, of human cognition, is that we want to go beyond that. Whether it's a good thing to, whether it leads to biases and errors, you know, it's kind of neither here nor there. It's kind of something that we do, whether we want to or not, to some extent. So our personality we can think of as a collection of traits. So whether you're extrovert, caring, easygoing, this sort of thing. But why do people do this sort of thing? And there are various possibilities. And really, for some kind of things, it might be one. For others, it might be another. So it might be that there's a grain of truth, that there are some people who are, you know, that certain faces go with certain personalities. Why is that? I'll give you at least one kind of example that might just about fall in that category. There's a sense of maybe self-fulfilling prophecies as well. So again, one candidate here might be attractive people who get lots of positive attention, and that therefore affects the way that they are socially in terms of their personality. Or at the other extreme, maybe somebody with a facial disfigurement who becomes very shy. That is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not a, you know, it's the kind of mechanism behind it is it's not biology in effect. This is another possibility, that basically you're using some of the cues that we've already talked about. So there are certain things that distinguish between different expressions, but this can kind of convey that somebody is a happy person or an angry person in terms of their trait dispositions, even when there's a supposedly neutral pose of them, that there is something about their face that implies one emotion over another. And of course, the other one is that basically this is kind of a culturally invented myth, that, you know, that one culture might agree that this person's competent, their face looks like this. You go to another culture, it's like that. So it's kind of interesting, but basically it's just, you know, something that our brains have soaked up as a cultural myth that we kind of abide by, but it doesn't have much of a basis. So if we think about attractiveness, so basically one kind of long-standing link between faces and traits is the idea that what is beautiful is good, in effect. So the idea here is that beauty is kind of a physical feature, but you attribute a trait to it. So socially desirable traits are attached to attractive people. And this was the study called What is Beautiful is Good, done by Dion et al., where they give males and females, kind of other male and female faces to rate in terms of what do you think that this person's personality is going to be like. And good-looking people attract socially desirable traits, and unattractive people get other kinds of traits. One possible mechanism for this is the so-called halo effect, that basically positive ratings on one dimension tend to lead to positive ratings on other dimensions that might, to all intents and purposes, be neutral. So the classic study of the halo effect by Nisbet and Wilson had a kind of a teacher appear and give a lecture to some students. And in one condition, the teacher was really warm and funny and engaging. The other, they were kind of cold and harsh monotone, or well, not monotone, but their mannerisms were nice. The key thing is that in both cases they dressed the same, they had the same physical appearance, and in both cases they had the same accent, although there might have been some variations there, actually. It wouldn't surprise me. But people rate the person who was behaving nicely as having a nicer physical appearance than not, whereas you've got the opposite happening with that. So the idea is that here the person's personality is affecting people's judgments about their physical appearance, even though the physical appearance was identical in both scenarios. So people can't separate out these things in the same ways we talked about in the last lecture, that we use the same kind of emotional machinery for all kinds of value judgments. That would be a neurobiological mechanism for this kind of halo effect and this beautiful equals good bias. So this is one of the a neuroimaging study that kind of looks at this. So they had, in effect, two studies done within the same participant. So one study was that they just present people with faces, and they're asked to rate them according to attractiveness. In the other case, they're presented with little vignettes. So he saved his sister from drowning, and they're asked to make moral judgments about them. What you find is that as both kinds of ratings go up, so does activity in your medial orbitofrontal cortex. So this, again, is kind of part of your hedonic apparatus. So your wanting of chocolate is your medial orbitofrontal cortex, and your evaluation of moral goodness and physical attractiveness is kind of tapping some of this kind of contextualization of emotions. The idea is we don't have completely separate neural circuits for every possible kind of evaluation. They all kind of tap to some extent some core mechanisms. And the opposite would be the insular, which is at least in some models kind of linked particularly to disgust and kind of bodily reactions and other things. So decreased beauty and moral goodness ratings linked to the insular. So the idea is that there is some neural overlap between these. There are some common principles that dictate why people judge how people judge physical attributes of attractiveness. So averageness is one of them. So basically, one way in which you study this is that you create facial composites. So you add, literally superimpose different faces. So obviously that requires a bit of morphing as well. But the more kind of faces you add to a composite, the more attractive they become. And obviously that at some point it plateaus, it saturates. But this can happen also when you do it with faces and profiles. So it's not just about symmetry. The average faces are more symmetrical. That is true, but it's not necessarily the driving thing. So symmetry is another cue. And again, the kind of experiment here is where you take a face and then you half one of the face and mirror image it with the other. And you could show that a mirror imaged whole face is more attractive than the sum of the two parts in effect. And again, there's some biology behind this in the sense that lack of symmetry is related to various kinds of undesirable things, poor nutrition, inbreeding, and so on, would tend to produce asymmetrical faces. And the idea is that this is some kind of evolved mechanism to avoid that. This is an interesting one because it seems to almost work in opposition to the others. So again here, so a hypermasculine and hyperfeminine face often isn't that more attractive, but something that is not just average, but average and a little bit more masculine or whatever works. So hypermasculine faces tend to be judged by women as not very attractive, whereas hyperfeminine faces by men tend to be much more judged as attractive, whether that's cultural or not. But there's some element of kind of what is called sexual dimorphism, and that's something we'll come back to. So if those are the physical determinants of attractiveness, there are also psychological determinants as well. So Buss is an evolutionary psychologist who basically argues that men and women are after different things in relationships, and they're after different things because their biology is calling out for different things in the sense of women needing to engage in childcare, having a partner who will support them in the childcare and so on. Again, they seem kind of old-fashioned ideas, but again, humans have been around for millions of years, and we have to kind of try and separate ourselves from these. So he argues that there are certain culturally independent sought-after traits, and he draws evidence from, again, cross-cultural evidence, including kind of hunter-gatherers and so on, in terms of what are desired traits in men and women across cultures. But of course, within a culture, there can be differences. So within this room, some people were attracted to different traits. So this is the study of Little et al. And what they do is that they take composite images based on perceived personality traits. So my understanding of what they did here, without going back and reading it, is that they would just present, say, 100 different images to people, and they would ask people to rate whether or not they think the person is assertive, easygoing, laid back, whatever. Okay? Then they take the ones which are the most not easygoing, and then they produce a composite of those. They take those who are the most seen as being assertive or whatever it is, and they create a composite of those. And what they find here is that they do two things. One is that they do the test that you did. They ask, which of these faces do you find the most attractive? And at the same time, they kind of ask, what is it that you look for in a partner? To what extent are you wanting somebody to be a cooperative partner? To what extent do you want to be dominated or dominating within a kind of relationship? And they find an association between what you kind of want psychologically in a partner and what these kind of facial signals are. And it's not clear what the facial signals are, but there is some agreement across people within them. But this kind of turns it on its head, that basically the what you find beautiful is kind of a projection of your psychological values onto somebody else's face. So it's not what is beautiful is good, it's what is good is beautiful. What you want determines what you're kind of attracted to. So it's another way of kind of thinking about the bidirectionality here between these processes. Any questions about? There are various ways in which you kind of create these images, and I'll kind of go through them. What about personality? So this is the kind of classic personality dimensions of Costa and McRae. And the question is, conscientiousness, extroversion, and so on. The question is, can you predict them? So what do you think this person is here? Call out some words. It hasn't got to be the exact ones. Agreeableness, maybe, yeah. And this person here. So, yeah. I think that these are actually created on extroversion, introversion, and so on. These are actually not composites of real humans. These are computer morphs that you can have algorithms for generating 3D models of the face. So you can either do it by having morphs of real human images or these kind of computer-generated ones. Kind of more feminine here, more masculine there. There are various ways of doing it. So anyway, in this particular study, what they did is that they took a whole group of undergraduates and got them to rate their own personality. So in a way, you know what the personality of these faces are, assuming that people can judge their own personality to some degree of accuracy, and they have their photograph taken. What they then do is that they would then take an independent group of people, show them the photos and say, can you predict this person's personality from them? So it's not clear what the mechanism of this is, whether it's a self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever. It's just saying, can you do it? Can you do it? And the answer is, to some extent, you can. You get extroversion coming out as being kind of predicted. Again, one of the challenges with this is it something about the face, or is it something about that particular image, something about that particular pose? Obviously, these are neutral images, but whether or not there is something more subtle in it. But it comes out here as being a correlation between what people say they are and what other people say they are, just from the face. And in males, you get a couple of other ones coming out. But extroversion seems to be the one coming out here. The other thing that they then do is that you can then create a kind of uber personality type. So you can take the 10% most neurotic faces, the 10% most extrovert and introvert, and then create composites of those. And then you can ask various things such as how attractive do you find these faces? So again, socially attractive personalities such as agreeableness but not neurotic. People find attractive an agreeable face but not a neurotic face in general, or an introverted face. So, but people don't know how these morphs are created, okay? But they are based on people's own personality ratings of themselves. So there is, in that sense, there is some truth in it. Whether it's a culturally defined truth or a biologically defined one isn't clear, but it's not junk. Okay, and this is a curious one here. That's basically, there's a whole kind of cottage industry around facial width to height ratio. So this was a master's project that I supervised that got published in the Journal of Psychology. I can tell you about that. But the original ones, well, actually one of the original ones was a study of skulls of an African kind of tribe, where you found that the kind of the alpha males in the tribe of the kind of dominant people, the males tend to have a greater facial width to height ratio. So in this one, this is the more dominant person in terms of, well, this person has a higher facial width to height ratio in effect here, but people would rate this person as being more socially dominant than that one, and in terms of kind of position within tribes and so on. This was done from some skulls in Africa. Within Western cultures, there's the classic study kind of is from 2008 by McCormack and Carrie McCormack, and they had two different things. One is that they looked at ice hockey players in Canada. This was done there. And what you can do here is that you can have an objective measure of aggression in that you just count up the number of penalties that person has had. So it's kind of like red cards. You get so many minutes accrued for aggressive behaviour in ice hockey. And that's effectively what you've got there, penalty minutes per game. And here you've got the facial width to height ratio of the ice hockey players. So the men with the greater facial width to height ratio accrue more penalties. The other measure that they had was a kind of game in which you're playing kind of competitively with another player to do this. But in one case, you can just kind of you can almost kind of take a point off yourself in order to take 2 points off another player. So there's no self-interest pointed there. Why are you taking points off yourself? There's an element of vindictiveness in that particular game that is actually acting against your own personal score in that. And people who behave vindictively in this game also have this trait. And this is, again, males. They didn't find it with females in that. The ice hockey players were all males. Here they contrasted males and females. Leadership. So this was the master's project that I did, looking at the CEOs. So these are the FTSE 100 CEOs, and showing that they, on average, have a higher facial width to height ratio than age and gender matched people. The American presidents have a higher facial width to height ratio than the average American male, and so on. So there is these kinds of associations of looking at it. So here, this is this guy, a prince called Todorov, who does all the kind of computer-generated faces. But basically, he's just generated hundreds, if not thousands, of faces, and just kind of got people to rate them along various dimensions. And you kind of find that there are two dimensions that come out very significantly. So he, again, is looking at dominance here, but he actually hasn't looked at facial width to height ratio, and I do wonder whether these differ. But basically what you've kind of find here in these kind of androgynous faces is that people kind of judge here, this is increasing dominance. Now, whether or, so these are kind of more typical masculinized features of the brow ridge and the square jaw. These are more kind of testosterone-based features. I'm not sure whether this is linked to facial width-height ratio, because it was done before that literature. And here, at the bottom of the dominant scale, you've got what's called baby face, which at least in males is seen as being more kind of sexually kind of ambiguous, as to, not a real man kind of boy-like features here. The other kind of dimension that you kind of get here would be trustworthiness. Attractiveness might be another one, but trustworthiness and attractiveness seem to be separate kind of dimensions within face space. And here, if you were to look at the untrustworthy versus the trustworthy, again, here you've got various features here in terms of the lips. So I don't know if you can see, but this person's got very more upturned lips, this up downturn, and the eyebrows, one goes like this, one goes like that. So kind of, so the idea here is that you're using maybe other kinds of expression-based information in which to compute trustworthiness. But if we look at this, if we look at the person down here, our baby-faced person here, if you take people who have baby faces and you ask them to rate their own personality, men tend to rate themselves as being less aggressive, more approachable, kind of warmer, and women as kind of having less physical power and less assertiveness. Again, where this is coming from, whether this is kind of society enforcing this on them, isn't clear. This is an interesting one, because here you seem to have an interaction between a social variable, so socioeconomic status, and something which is biological, what your face looks like. So although on average baby-faced men tend to be consider themselves as less aggressive and so on, if you come from a low socioeconomic status background, you can kind of almost rebel against that. So here I'm thinking kind of Wayne Rooney and so on, where you've got baby face, but actually you're wanting to be the alpha male, the aggressive person and so on. So here this isn't a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, it's almost a reaction maybe against a social stereotype if you're from a particular disadvantaged niche in that particular case. And this is the person who studied baby-faced men is somebody called Zebrovich, but again she's gone into courts and compared people who at least superficially committed the same crimes, and looked at the sentencing that's been meted out, and shown that baby-faced men get lighter sentences here for what on paper seems to be the same crime. So again, the kind of inference there is that the judge assumes that this person has a less aggressive disposition and therefore is moderating the sentence that is meted out. So that the judge has made a psychological inference that this person is less aggressive, despite the fact that on paper the evidence seems to suggest otherwise. Trustworthiness appears in this kind of face space as kind of the orthogonal dimension to dominance. Again, it seems to be linked to certain kind of facial features that are kind of expression related. You tend to rate faces that look like you as more trustworthy, but less attractive. The reason why you do that is to avoid kind of incest, that you shouldn't be attracted to people who look too much like you, but you might want to trust them. So a kind of a kin-based mechanism. So again, this might be one of the things that again is fairly conserved across species. If you were to present these kinds of faces to people in fMRI, you find that these people at this end of the scale activate the amygdala more than there. So again, the amygdala is often associated with fear, but it's certainly kind of intense emotional evaluations. Dominance is kind of more neutral in terms of how people judge that. So you don't have the dominance dimension kind of activating the amygdala in the same way as trust. But it seems to be that this chap here would activate your amygdala a lot more than there, kind of increasingly so here. If you damage your amygdala, people are perceived as being trustworthy. Everybody's trustworthy if you lesion your amygdala. So you struggle to make that kind of evaluation. Interestingly, these kinds of trait judgments seem to be spared in people with autism and people with congenital prosopagnosia, so people who struggle to recognise identity in faces. They seem to be able to extract average structural features from faces. So here, in order to recognise this, you are processing a face structurally, but you're not individuating. You're doing the opposite of individuating. You're kind of almost having, average facial templates and so on. And that seems to be achievable in people who have congenital prosopagnosia. So what's going on here? Well, people do this. Again, it's not something that they should do in terms of individual interactions, because it's not going to be reliable at the level of one person, one kind of interaction. But of course, over hundreds or thousands of interactions, it may lead to above chance predictions. Whether or not that's enough kind of motive or justification is not clear. Certainly, it's a bit worrying that it influences criminal sentencing and voting behaviour, and it's good that this research can actually kind of put into place mechanisms for mitigating against that. What is it that's driving them? I think, again, you've got to look at different things for the different ones. Again, the facial width to height ratio seems to be the one with perhaps the most clearest mechanism, but even that is kind of up for debate. Okay, so next week we'll talk about empathy and mind reading, so theory of mind.